We've been going through, as you know, the Psalms, certain Psalms, selected Psalms. And tonight we're going to look at the characteristic that God portrays of Himself in the Psalms, the characteristic of being a refuge, of God being a refuge, a place of refuge, the refuge itself, of a person being able to take refuge in God. So I want to look at a couple words as we get started here, and one of them is the noun, the Hebrew noun, mahaseh, that speaks of God being the place of refuge, the refuge itself. It's mahaseh, M-A-H-S-E-H, and it's pronounced mahaseh. And we're going to run into this word in just a minute. This is the noun, the refuge. God is my refuge. Often David will say, God is my rock, my refuge, my fortress, my high tower. This is the word he uses, mahaseh. And it means that not only is he a place of refuge, but he's a someone. God is a person, not a thing. He's personal and he's a person. So it's someone turned to for security. Also someone turned to as a shelter from danger. All of these things are the mahaseh, God as the refuge for man. And it's also someone, God in this case, who's turned to as a hiding place. All of these definitions come out of the Hebrew, mahaseh. David will say, God is my refuge. He's my security. He's my shelter from danger. He's even my hiding place. Now, when you look at this word in the Hebrew as a verb, to take refuge in God, it's a different word. And this is the word chasah. C-H-A-S-A-H is how I would spell it, chasah. And it means to take refuge or to find, not only to go to a safe place, but to find a safe place. To find that safe place and then go to it. So to find and go to a safe location or a shelter. And that's what it means to take refuge in God. My soul takes refuge in God, the psalmist says a lot. To find God and to go to Him as a safe location or a shelter. So the word tonight, the characteristic we're looking at that God shows, reveals to man through the Psalms, is the fact that He is man's refuge. He's a shelter from danger. And I want to go to Psalm 7. If you'll turn to Psalm 7 with me. We're going to look at a few facts about this psalm. I'm going to paint a little bit of a picture for you, but not too much of what's going on in David's life. And at this time in his life, who he turns to as his refuge. A few things to look at. In Psalm 7, the superscription says, a shigayon of David, which he sang to Yahweh, which he sang to the Lord concerning Cush, a Benjamite. There's a lot in that first little statement there that I want to look at very quickly. Your Bibles may not say shigayon. It may say, anybody have a different word? A meditation. Yeah, some Bibles say meditation. The Hebrew word there is shigayon, and so many of these beginning superscriptions in the Psalms, if you'll look at Psalm 7 there, it says a meditation of David, or a shigayon in the English. But so many of these beginning words in the Psalms are still disputed. If you look at the beginning of Psalm 16, it says a miktam of David. And a lot of people much smarter in the Hebrew than I'll ever be, are still debating what these superscription words mean. But there seems to be at least a little bit of a consensus that a shigayon may be a poem written with intense feeling. It's not just poetry, it's not just the thoughts of a man, but this was an intensified situation that he wrote about. And that may be what this is. It's a very emotional psalm. highly emotionally driven. It's an intense psalm. What intense feeling then was David feeling? If that's what this means, a shigayon written by David, what was going on? Well, I'll tell you two things. David, for much of his young life, as a young man married to a woman named Michal, who was Saul's daughter, for a portion of David's life, he was chased by his father-in-law, Saul. Saul tried to pin him with a javelin, with a spear to the wall, at least 3 times in the Scriptures, the book of 2 Samuel. Saul was very jealous of David. The women of Israel used to sing a song, and you can read this in the Bible in several places. But when David killed Goliath, David was the great military leader of Israel for a time, and the women got to like David. And when they came in from battle, the women would say, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. And that's just enough to make a man upset. So the women of Israel were feigning, as it were, at handsome David's feet because he was the hero of the day, and Saul didn't like it. If you go to read that, if you look up that phrase, you'll find it, and around it, there's a lot of Saul jealousy there. So Saul's father-in-law had been chasing David because he wanted him dead for some time. Cush, it's said here, I said that because of this. This is the only place in the Bible where this particular guy's mentioned. Cush the Benjamite. Now, I don't know if you know or if you remember, but David was from which tribe? Which tribe of Israel did King David come from? Which tribe of Israel did Jacob say, the scepter shall not depart from? Judah. The king, the rightly appointed king of Israel, was always going to come from the tribe of Judah. But there was a king before David, that was Saul. And Saul was not of the tribe of Judah. Anybody remember what tribe Saul was from? Read who Cush is, and then tell me who Saul's tribe is. Saul was a Benjamite. So Cush would have been a follower of Saul, probably sent by Saul to kill David. Saul sent armies after King David. And so David is in this situation, this intense moment in life when all seems lost, according to the psalm. When we read the first couple of verses, you'll see it. It's a very intense thing. All seems lost. Cush is at his heels about to kill him. And so we have to ask the question, who does David turn to? In this situation in life, a very, very dire situation, who does David turn to? Look what it says in Psalm 7, verse 1 and 2. David says, O Lord my God. When you see Lord in all capital letters, it's always Yahweh. He's calling God by His covenant name, Yahweh. So David says, O Yahweh my God. I love when David uses this phrase. Never turn to any false gods like Saul did. David was a man who worshiped Yahweh only. He was an obedient Jew in that regard. He worshiped one God, the one true God. He worshiped Yahweh in every situation in his life. So David says, O Yahweh my God, in you I have taken refuge. I have found you and have gone to you as my hiding place, as my shelter, my safe location, my shelter from danger. O Yahweh my God, in you I have taken refuge. And then he cries out to God, save me from all those who pursue me. Not only father-in-law Saul, but here Cush, Saul's Benjamite. Save me from all those who pursue me and deliver me, or he, it turns singular now, or he, Cush the Benjamite, will tear my soul like a lion, dragging me away while there is none to deliver. Very interesting last phrase. David, when he says there is none to deliver, is letting us know there is no human army that can help him. He's outnumbered, he's overpowered, he's facing imminent death. Cush has the upper hand, and Cush can easily kill him at this point if God doesn't intervene. If God doesn't act as David's safety, as his safe location through this storm, Cush will get the upper hand on David and kill him. Or it says in verse 2, Cush will tear my soul like a lion, dragging me away to death while there is none to deliver. David had no one to turn to. So who does David turn to? Yahweh. Now I want to ask you a couple of questions. Seeing that David was overpowered and outnumbered and facing imminent death, who did Saul turn to? David. Who did David turn to? The answer is Yahweh, who he considered not only the only God, but his personal God. David turned to God, his refuge. Now here are the other questions. Was it a successful prayer? Was David killed by Cush the Benjamite? Does anybody know? Factually, biblically, was David killed here in Psalm 7 by Cush the Benjamite, who he said, I am in imminent danger of being killed by? Is this the man that killed him, or did God answer his prayer? What's the answer? The answer is we better look at the Bible and see how it is that King David died. Because it wasn't here, and it wasn't at the hand of Cush the Benjamite. We don't know the rest of this story. Because his name, Cush the Benjamite, only appears here in the Bible. But there is no doubt about the fact that God delivered him exactly as David asked him to, that God acted as David's refuge. David found him and turned to him for security. And God answered his prayer and acted on David's behalf as his refuge. We don't know how God defeated Cush the Benjamite. But we know that he did, because look what it says in 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 29, concerning King David. It says, the king vowed, this is David on very late in his life. The question has come up, who is going to be your successor, David? Who's going to take the throne of Israel after you? And the famous Bathsheba has come to King David and saying, you promised me that my son Solomon would take the throne. And David is verifying that fact. So King David vowed and he said, now listen to what David, at the end of his life, how he refers to his God. Yahweh, my God. He says, as Yahweh lives. I love this man, David. As Yahweh the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from all distress. If you read the Psalms, over 70 are attributed to David, and most of the Psalms of David are lament psalms, where David is in trouble and pleads with God to save him, to deliver him from an enemy. The vast majority of David's Psalms, David is in trouble and cries out to God for help. And in the last days of his life, what does David call God? The God, Yahweh, who redeemed my life from all distress. I never called on this God, David would say, when he didn't answer. I never sought him as a refuge when he didn't save. It's a lot to say about how we're supposed to live this life ourselves. As Yahweh lives, who has redeemed my life from all distress, surely as I vowed to you by Yahweh, the God of Israel, saying, your son Solomon shall be king after me, and he shall sit on my throne in my place, I will indeed do so this day. We know that this is the end of King David's life because he's given the throne away. He has appointed his son Solomon to be the king of Israel after him. So David is speaking to Bathsheba from the king's palace in Jerusalem in the last days of his life. He's not in some cave hiding from Cush the Benjamite. He's in a peaceful place. He's in a prosperous place. He's in a king's palace. And he's got the authority still to let his son be the king after him. Look what it says in 2 Kings, just a few verses after that. In chapter 2, verse 1 and 2, we read about David's last moments. It says, as David's time to die drew near, he charged Solomon his son. It's actually a very beautiful charge. We should read more of it than just one verse. What would King David charge his son on his own deathbed? As David's time to die drew near, he charged Solomon his son. So he's no longer speaking to his wife Bathsheba. Solomon is there and he's speaking to his son. And David says, in the peace of the king's palace in his own bed, David tells his son, I am going the way of all the earth. What does he mean? I will die very, very soon. I'm going the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and show yourself a man. I love this King David. I got to read you a couple more verses. He says, and keep the charge of Yahweh your God. He's not only my God, son, he's your God, and he has to be, or you'll fail in this life. The final words of a man to his son. I hope I have the presence of mind. I pray that God gives me the presence of mind to be able to charge my children from my deathbed with words like this. Keep the charge of Yahweh your God. To walk in his ways, to keep his statutes and his commandments and his judgments and his testimony as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. That the Lord may fulfill his word which he spoke concerning you to me. David. As David's time to die drew near, he charged Solomon his son. And look at the verse I'm about to put on the board, 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 10, just a few verses after his statements to his boy. Then David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. I'm only showing you this, well, because it's interesting, and you need to know how the great King David, the man after God's own heart, the apple of God's eye, how he died. He died in peace, with no one chasing him, in obedience to God and the Mosaic law that God had laid down for Israel to follow. He died with the son at his side, his beloved son, Shalom, Solomon, the son of peace. He died in the king's palace in Jerusalem. That I say because in Psalm 7, the Shiggaion, this very emotionally, highly charged, intense feeling psalm, when David cries out to God to be his refuge because no human could save him. There is none to help me but God. God did exactly that. He was exactly that for David. He was his shelter. He was his hiding place. He was his protection, his shelter from danger, his safe location. He was all those things to King David. So another question, again, before we move on to the next psalm that I want to look at. Did God answer David's cries for help in David's most desperate times in life? Yes, he did. Did Yahweh prove himself to be David's shelter from danger from his enemies? Did Yahweh prove himself to David when David cried to God over and over and over for deliverance? Did God's actions in David's life prove to David that God indeed is my shelter from danger? Yeah, because in David's last words, he told his wife, God has kept me from all distresses. He's kept me from all distresses. Every time I cried to him, he answered. Then I'll ask this question, then according to Psalm 7, who should we turn to when situations are dire in our lives and seem hopeless? The same God that David turned to. Allow God to prove Himself to be your shelter from danger. Psalm 14, turn to that one with me. We'll look at it briefly because I'm not sure, but I think I smell gumbo. People that listen to this on tape will think, what is he talking about? I want to look at Psalm 14 briefly. In Psalm 14, it's a lament psalm, as most of David's are. You could also almost call it a messianic psalm also. There's a lot going on in Psalm 14. It covers a broad range of psalm genres, types of psalms that we've talked about. But David longs for God's kingdom here. He longs for God's kingdom to be established on earth when the wicked people would be destroyed. That's what we're looking at in Psalm 14. David longs for God's kingdom when wickedness on earth will be destroyed. Anybody today in that camp with David longing for God's kingdom to be established on this earth so that wicked and evilness will be done away with forever? Can't wait. Psalm 14 verse 4, the superscription before the verses, for the choir director, a psalm of David. I've told you that the psalms are songs. This is the Jewish songbook, and David has written a song, and he's written this song and presented it to the choir director. Have the choir learn this song so we can sing it. A psalm of David, so we know who wrote the psalm. I want to drop you down to Psalm 14, verse 4. Look what it says. Do all the workers of wickedness not know? So he's asking a question about evil people on earth, wicked people on earth. And in context here, it's people who are evil to God's people, Israel. Do the evil and wicked people not know this? Do they really not know this fact? Is his question. Do all the workers of wickedness not know, these people who eat up my people, that's Israel, who eat up my people as they eat bread, like you'd take a piece of bread and devour it. The evil people, the kings of the earth, are trying to destroy Israel. Don't they know about these who call on the name of the Lord? These people who do not call upon the name of the Lord, don't they know about Israel who calls on the name of the Lord? Here's the thought that he has. Look at what it says in verse 5. In verse 4 he says, do the workers of wickedness not know? And in verse 5 he asks the question that they are in great dread. They're in trouble. They live like they don't know it. They act like they don't know God. They do not acknowledge the presence of God. Look up real fast and tell me what verse 1 says. This is a famous psalm. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. Who's the fool in verse 4? But this worker of wickedness against Israel. How could you be so foolish as to think there is no God and to think that Israel exists without the protection of her God? And you'll come against Israel? Don't you know that you are in dread because God, it says, is with the righteous generation. God protects the righteous. God protects His remnant. Always has, always will. And this is David's question to the wicked and the evilness around him. Don't you know that there's a day coming when the God who you refuse to acknowledge will crush you? Verse 6, this is what he says to them. You would put to shame the counsel of the afflicted, the counsel of the poor. It's hard to understand the way the English writers chose these words, but what it means, what the Hebrew phrase more literally means, is you might succeed in frustrating the lives of God's people. The way that God's people, Israel, function the wicked may succeed in frustrating that on earth. For a time. But only for a time. Because God will one day vindicate Israel, the righteous, because they trust in God, their refuge. You would put to shame the counsel of the afflicted. You might frustrate the lies of God's people for a time. You are succeeding in David's day. But the last phrase in verse 6 says, but Yahweh is his refuge. Yahweh is the refuge, the shelter, the hiding place. All those phrases in the definition, Yahweh acts in that way for his people Israel. And you wicked people of the earth, you need to know this. Yahweh is Israel's refuge. God will one day vindicate Israel. And that's why when you get to the very end verse, you see in Psalm 14 verse 7, oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion. Is that ever going to happen? You bet it is. Has it happened yet? Not the way David wants it. Because this is what he's asking for in verse 7. When Yahweh restores the captive people, Jacob will rejoice and Israel will be glad. That event hasn't happened yet. This is a millennial kingdom thing. This is following the battle of Armageddon, where God comes back to avenge Israel, to destroy all her enemies, all the workers of wickedness, and David longs for that day when wickedness loses and God and his people Israel win. So Yahweh is Israel's refuge, while all the earth, all the kings of the earth, all the kingdoms of earth tried to destroy her. And going back to verse 1, only a fool would say that there is no God. I want to say 5 statements and then give you a few verses and close. Only a fool, David says, would say that there is no God. Now, when you read that, you may think, well, this is a philosophical question. And I would say no to that. This isn't philosophy. This isn't David saying only a fool would decide that there is no God in existence. I think when you read this psalm, it's more of a practical issue. David is saying only a fool who knows there is a God would live as if there's not one. Because what does the Bible tell us about all humanity and about the fact that God exists? That there is no one who has an excuse. All men know because of what God created that God exists. Only a fool would choose not to acknowledge a God that they know in their heart of hearts, in their quiet times, He's out there. Only a fool would choose to live life as if God doesn't hold humanity to a moral standard. Only a fool would live that way. As if there is no God. As if there is no moral right and moral wrong. As if it doesn't matter how I live because there is no one to judge me. There's no one who will ultimately decide whether what I did was right or wrong. I'll live as if there is no God, even though I know He's there. It's a practical question. We know that because of Romans 1. David may not have known it when he wrote it, but because of what we know about men and their understanding of God's existence, this is a practical question. These are men living as if there is no God, as if there will be no judgment, as if there is no consequence for what they do, especially to God's people, Israel. So only a fool would say that there is no God, would refuse to acknowledge God's existence and live as if He didn't exist. Only fools would say there is no God who protects Israel. You don't have to know much. Even in David's day in 1000 BC, the history of Israel was known. In many of the writings of Israel, it harkens back to the days of Egypt when God brought Israel out of Egypt with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, how God dried the sea. These things are known about Israel. They're in not only Jewish history, but in sayings of the day. Only a fool would live as if. Only a fool who would work wickedness against the people of Israel. You'd have to be a fool to say there is no God who protects Israel. Even 3,000 years ago, her history was well known. Only fools would live so corruptly on earth, thinking God doesn't take notice. Read the rest of that when you go home, and you'll find all these thoughts. Only fools would treat Israel as if there was no God protecting her, acting as her eternal refuge. God says Yahweh is Israel's refuge. When all the world tries to defeat, God through David says Israel's resting place, her hiding place, her safe location, her shelter in the storm is Yahweh Himself. So these fools on earth, David says, will face judgment when God restores Israel. See, David says, oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion. But what has to happen to Israel's enemies for Israel to rejoice and be glad? They have to be destroyed. So although David doesn't say all of that, the thought is very clear in his statement. I want Israel delivered from the workers of wickedness. And that will only happen when Yahweh decides to restore His captive people. When Jacob will rejoice and Israel will be glad. The fools of the earth will face judgment one day, and David pleaded with God that that day would come soon. He wanted the wickedness to end. A few more verses about God being a refuge in the Psalms. We're not going to develop these. I just want you to see them. In Psalm 62, verse 8, the psalmist says, trust in Him, God, Yahweh, at all times, O people. A pleading with His people, Israel. Trust in God, not in man, not in yourselves. Trust in God at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before Him. Because in the most dire situation you can ever be in, God is a refuge for us. He is the secure place. He's the shelter from danger. He's the deliverer. Psalm 73 verse 28 says, but as for me, I love when the Bible gets personal, but as for me, the nearness of God is my good. I have made Yahweh, I have made the Lord God my refuge, that I may tell of all your works. Psalm 73 is a great piece of writing. This is the psalmist who says, my foot had almost slipped when I saw that wickedness had its way in the world, that the wicked were prospering, that the wicked were in authority. I almost slipped. I almost fell. I almost considered the walk in my life of obedience to God. I almost considered it a waste of time. Because if the wicked are going to win, why am I being so pious? Why am I sacrificing? Why am I keeping pleasures from myself? Why don't I live like the wicked? Until my eyes looked to your temple. And then he concludes, as for him, when the wicked have everything that the world can offer, the psalmist here says, being in the presence of God is enough for me. Can we say that? Can you say that in your daily walk when things get tough? When everybody around you seems to be flourishing in their evil and their wickedness. Maybe not everybody, but some around us. Can you say that my relationship with God is all I need? It's all I truly desire. And the fact that God is in me, indwells me, is near me, loves me, cares for me, will never abandon me, that's enough. That's enough. Let the world have what the world has to offer. I have made the Lord God my refuge, no one else but God, that I may tell of your works. Psalm 91 verse 2, I will say to Yahweh. This is as if a person, the psalmist, is speaking to God. And what are the words he wants to speak to God? How does he want to address God? He wants to say, God, my fortress, you are my refuge, you are my God, in whom I trust, no one else. I will say to the Lord, my refuge, my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. Psalm 91 verse 8 and 9 says, you will only look on with your eyes and see the recompense of the wicked. Again, in many of these psalms, you see the wicked brought before God. Look at all this wickedness, Lord. And then the psalmist will resolve that and say, one day God, the wicked will receive what's coming to them. God will judge them. And we see that again here. There's a fight between wickedness and righteousness, and the righteous people on earth are always getting trampled on. In Psalm 91 verse 8, he says, you will only look on with your eyes and see the repayment to the wicked, because God will repay. For you have made Yahweh my refuge, even the Most High, your dwelling place. You've made Yahweh my God, your God, and your hiding place. Very, very personal. He's my God, but He's big enough to share. He can protect us all. He's my refuge, and you have also made Him your refuge, your dwelling place, your shelter. And the last one here, Psalm 118, verse 8 and 9. This is said to be the very center of the Bible. Whether it is or not, I don't know. But of all the writings of Scripture, they say that Psalm 118, you can win a trivia contest with this. They say that Psalm 118 verse 8 is the center verse. I'm talking about numbers of verses before and numbers of verses after. That Psalm 118 verse 8 is the center of the Bible. And if it is, isn't it interesting that it says it is better to take refuge in Yahweh than to trust in man? That'd be a great verse to be the middle of the Bible. It is better to take refuge, to let Yahweh be your refuge. Remember, it means to find and to go to a safe location or a shelter. Find that God is that safe location or that shelter and take shelter in His loving arms. It is better to take refuge in Yahweh than to trust in any man. It's better to take refuge in Yahweh than to trust in princes. Even the ruling caste, even the kings of the earth. Yahweh is where we find our deliverance. Yahweh is where we find our shelter, because Yahweh is our eternal refuge. Our refuge. Let's close in prayer.